Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 News. The stewarding drama continues today. Going into the Brazilian Grand Prix, Jos Verstappen makes his point very clear that he believes there is bias in the stewarding room when it comes to decisions involving Max Verstappen, Johnny Herbert, former F1 driver and steward for last weekend's Mexico Grand Prix and this weekend's Brazilian Grand Prix, says there is no such thing, but makes some very interesting statements that you might not necessarily expect from someone who's meant to be entirely impartial. Lots to dive into today as ever. Very much interested your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. First of all, Helmut Marko has said, and Eric Van Haren has said, and seemingly Red Bull have said, that yes, Max will get a penalty, but actually Max just now in the media interviews has said, well, they've not told me yet, so it looks like it's going to be happening at this point, just for the internal combustion engine. I guess Red Bull feel like they can't necessarily afford anything worse than a 5-place pen, so it's going to be fascinating, isn't it, because any mechanical related DNF for Max blows the championship wide open again, even possibly for Charles Leclerc, albeit highly unlikely on that front. But if Lando was to hypothetically win this weekend and Max was to DNF for some reason, that's a big swing, right? That's 22 points in the championship with 4 races or 3 races to go, and there's still another sprint in there. So of course it's on already, but it's absolutely on in that scenario. So that's the thing that Red Bull have to avoid, is that, okay, they need a new power unit for sure, they need a new ICE, they believe the other components, the MGUH, MGUK, other factors like that will survive. But if they don't, then of course that's a serious issue. They might need to take another penalty in the near future if that was to happen, and they'd prefer to just, go for the 5 place here. Let's say Max sticks at P1, P2, he's going to start P6, P7 on Sunday. Puts him in a decent position. I think this weekend for Max, and honestly Lando's championship hopes in some level, assuming that he executes a pretty good weekend, rely on Mercedes to some degree, because the Mercedes should qualify ahead of wherever Max is going to end up on the grid. And if the Mercedes are racy, as they typically have been in Brazil, albeit not last year, was an absolute disaster class around here for the W14, then it could potentially be a bit of a different story. Of course, the W13 in 2022 was phenomenal around Brazil, so it's been a tricky couple of years in Mercedes, as we full well know. Now, Liam Lawson to Red Bull is seemingly getting more and more likely. There's been lots of reasons, actually, why they would and should be interested in Franco Colapinto's services. Straight to Red Bull seems unlikely, although not entirely implausible. It's more likely that Liam Lawson would potentially get that opportunity alongside Max Verstappen. I thought it was interesting what he said to the media today as well. He was asked the question, like, what do you think about beefing with Alonso in Austin? What do you think about beefing with Perez in Mexico? And he says, okay, look, I'm not here to make enemies, but I'm certainly not here to make friends, right? And I think it's just this little, arrogant, cocky edge that Lawson has that I kind of like about him, and I think that he needs to have if he wants to be a top-quality F1 driver in the longer term. So, look, you don't want to go into too much detail on why there's been this beef with some of the veterans of the sport, but he certainly makes it clear that he's not going away. And, Ted Kravitz was mentioning in the interview that he reckons that Helmut Marko probably finds this rather positive. Hamilton was also talking about Colapinto and saying, look, there is a seat available, and Franco, not saying it's for him to decide, but I'll be pushing on my side to make sure that that potentially is going to be happening, right? Because he's obviously doing a good job. There are plenty of reasons why him either going to Sauber, but, does he really want to go there? Honestly, if you're Colapinto, would you go to Sauber and take the empty seat alongside Hülkenberg, or would you just stay as a Williams reserve and almost guarantee yourself another drive at some point, given the fact that you've impressed quite substantially? Now, Mexico was not a great weekend for Colapinto compared to Albon. Certainly in qualifying, that was true. In the race, we never knew, because Albon crashed out with Yuki Tsunoda earlier in the Grand Prix, and Colapinto finished 12th, I believe. Got the penalty for the collision with Lawson, which was, I'm not really sure that was fully justified, but it was certainly on the borderline anyway. So I think he needs a bit of a bounce back weekend, because, he's obviously impressed for several rounds. Now is the time where decisions are made. So he has to finish this triple header strong, no doubt this weekend, I would say, in Brazil. Hamilton also mentions that the lap in Senna's car that he's going to do, or maybe multiple laps, I don't know, on the Saturday, this was meant to be a secret, and his plan is that he, had a white suit ready with Senna's helmet, so he would just go out and drive the 1990 McLaren as if, Senna was actually in the car, right? But unfortunately, that's now been leaked to the public, but it's still going to be cool to see regardless. Now, let's talk about some of the drama, because there's always drama in F1, and especially right about now. Max Verstappen has been responding to various comments. Damon Hill, over the last few days, said a few interesting words, says that, basically he's not a fan of Max's driving style. He doesn't like it when Max drives in the way that he did in Mexico. Max responds and says, look, it's my 10th year in F1. I think I know what I'm doing, right? And Max certainly knows what he's doing. What he's doing is using every conceivable avenue to try and win the championship, whatever form that potentially takes. And look, whether that crosses sporting lines, I think it does. But it doesn't, take away the trophy in the cabinet, of course. And we've seen this story play out many years in sports, certainly in Formula 1, for example, certainly with some of the great champions. Now, this is a funny comment from Damon Hill, who said he was right to get a penalty. Whether 10 seconds was the right penalty, I don't know. The second move he did was daft. It was dick dastardly stuff. He simply accelerated to the apex and just pushed Lando off track, who didn't have much option. Silly driving. Max let himself down there. He's got such brilliance and a massive competitive spirit. I don't think it was something to be proud of what he did. The problem Max has got is he simply refuses to concede any turf at all to anyone in an overtake. That is the situation. So, this whole driving like Dick Dastardly, I thought was kind of funny, but obviously Max wasn't happy about it. And he also kind of said that Red Bull need to take some responsibility here, because they, on the radio and in their communications, they effectively allow Max to get away with whatever he wants. And, maybe that's not helps the situation. Max responds and says, I don't listen to those type of guys. So obviously there should be no real surprise there, but of course he does have to listen to what the stewards have to say, because at the end of the day, the referees of the sport, they make the rules. Well, they don't necessarily make the rules, but the FIA has the rules, and the stewards, the referees, implement the rules in the way that they see fit, and if they do their job correctly, then, unfair driving will result in punishments as a result, and hopefully deterrence. I think that was my point the other day, that I think that second incident is, if you watch it from Lando's perspective as well, his onboards, very, clearly very dangerous. Lando was pretty lucky not to wipe both of them out there at the race. And would Max have been disappointed had he wiped them both out of the race? Maybe for a split second, but then, all part of the plan, right? That would have obviously prevented Lando from getting points in the championship. So I think incidents like that where safety is at risk, I think there needs to be a conversation around how do we actually disincentivize this? Because a 10-second penalty, it's relatively severe, but in the grand scheme of things in a Grand Prix, how much difference does that really make? A drive-through, a stop and go, that's when you really get some serious penalties, and it actually is a disincentive, because obviously, as we mentioned, even on the Mexico Grand Prix weekends, Max had the option, had he wanted to give the position back to Lando. He overtook Lando off the track. He knew he was getting a penalty for it as soon as he did it. He didn't know how severe it would be. He probably guessed 10 seconds. That's what they gave him. But he stayed ahead of Lando for 20-odd laps. And as a result of that, Lando lost time in the battle eventually with the Ferraris. Had it been a stop-go penalty or basically a drive-through penalty, you have to serve those within 3 laps. So Max would have been forced to yield into the pit lane, or he's going to get black flagged and disqualified, at which point Lando would have been free to go, not getting held up by a driver who's overtaken him illegally. So it's part of the drama. Max knows all this, obviously, which is why he's so difficult to stop. And as George Russell says, it's getting beyond entertaining or beyond sporting. It's almost just now unfair. The first one was maybe a 60-40, whether we should have got a penalty. The last one, I've not seen anything like that since probably Brazil 21. As I said the other day, I would say Jeddah 21 is maybe a better example. But look, we've got plenty else to dive into. But the big drama today was coming down to how these decisions are made in the steward room. You guys also might remember back in Brazil 2021, the turn 4 incident. Of course, Hamilton eventually gets the overtake done and wins the Grand Prix emphatically. But the incident a few laps earlier than that, you guys might remember, for the few days after the incident, the FIA couldn't find the onboard footage, right? So the cars have forward-facing cameras, they have rear-facing cameras, and sometimes the one that actually goes to the live feed changes depending on the situation. I don't think it's entirely randomized, but it's like, because Max was defending from Hamilton, the feeds they had, the live feed that was getting broadcast basically, was the rear-facing camera. So the front-facing camera had the footage, and it was saved onto the camera, stuck to the car maybe. So you guys remember it took them a few days to like find the lost footage of Max's onboard from his front-facing T-cam, because at the time they were using the rear-facing one. So they've now said that no, they are going to make the forward-facing cameras constantly live for race control and stewards to prevent these type of issues. And it was another problem, of course, last weekend as well in Mexico. However, let's talk about the stewards, because Johnny Herbert, among others, are Formula One stewards for the FIA. As we know, it's not the same stewards every weekend. Some weekends it's a certain bunch of guys, some weekends it's another bunch of guys, and as many drivers have said, we just need some consistent refereeing, because in Formula One already, it's so arbitrary sometimes. It's like, well, was he ahead of the apex? Wasn't he? Was he significantly alongside? It's like, things are so arbitrary. You at least need a consistent messaging so that you can rely as a driver and a team that at least the decisions are being made as far as possible consistently. And if you're changing out the people in the office, how can it be that consistent? Well, the FIA, I'm sure, will give their perspective on that. But Johnny Herbert, former Formula One driver, I think 3-time race winner as well. He was working with Sky Sports F1 over the last couple of years. Was he not the man that informed Verstappen that he won the title in Japan 22 maybe? But you guys know his face, we'll see him in a second. He's now a Formula One steward for the FIA, and he's given some interesting comment on Max Verstappen's driving. He said the following: the penalties in Mexico will not stop Max Verstappen from pushing Lando off the track in the future. The whole intention of Verstappen was to try and get Ferrari the 1-2 finish. I think that's definitely what Verstappen intended and tried to achieve. I understand why he did it, but I don't agree with it. I don't think many people do. Here he is, Johnny Herbert, former F1 driver and FIA steward, arriving at the track. Now, of course, it's totally fine for these guys to have their own opinions, but speaking to the press publicly in this way, as someone who is meant to be entirely impartial, did strike me as rather strange. So he went on to say, the guidelines we followed, the teams agree with our decision, the right decision was made, the 20-second penalty for Max Verstappen was not harsh. Was Verstappen's driving style over the edge or over the top? Yes, it was. Verstappen's driving style was harsh, especially when he's taken a fellow driver off the track. It's an absolute no-no for me, current drivers, former drivers, and stewards. But obviously saying the rest of the guys agreed with his perspective. I am such a big fan of Verstappen, and it frustrates me massively when he drives the way he did in Mexico. Now, I'm sure there's many of us who can relate to at least a sentence somewhat similar to that. But surely as a steward, like, first of all, suggesting that you are a fan or not of a certain driver, because saying, oh, I'm a big fan of Max, not really any different to say, oh yeah, I'm not a big fan of Lando, right? I mean, it's like, who cares? Like, why would I care what your opinion is of the driver? It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. And certainly as a steward, you would, like, if you hear a referee say, oh, well, I'm such a, big fan of Manchester United and Bruno Fernandes, I just hate when, he cries to the referee or whatever, right? It's like, or he dives, I don't know. For some reason, I'm picking on Bruno today. But you know what I'm saying? It's like, if you get a referee saying, oh, yeah, I'm a big fan of this team, but it's just a shame when their players behave like that, it's like, well, hang on, I only meant to be entirely impartial. So, and look, nobody is really saying that Johnny Herbert is making decisions pro-Verstappen. That's actually completely the opposite argument. But just even the concept of this being said in general is somewhat strange to me. He doesn't need to do it. He's so good in the cockpit, and at this point in the championship, he just needs to stay out of trouble and drive as well as possible, which might be one argument, but the other argument is if you can take out Lando, you do stand to benefit. When Verstappen goes into this horrible mindset of trying to gain an advantage by taking a fellow driver off the racetrack so Ferrari can get the 1-2, that's where Verstappen needs to know that he doesn't have to do that. But also, you should make sure that he doesn't do that, because the penalties need to be harsh enough if you do that. That's my take. Just win in the cleanest possible way that you can. The attitude in the stewards room was really good, and our decision was clear because the guidelines tell us what to look at and how to deal with the situation. When we applied the 2 10-second penalties to Verstappen, we were all in agreement. Always remember, there are 4 stewards who make these decisions, which of course is cutting down on the idea that there is any bias in play, but others would potentially disagree. So, look, Johnny Herbert has said Max has a horrible mindset sometimes, is not driving in a way that he especially likes, and maybe that's fair enough. But when you're a referee, you'd think maybe don't say that publicly or something. So this is where Jos Verstappen kind of waded in over the last couple of days and says the FIA should take a good look at the steward staff, who they put there, and whether there was any appearance of a conflict of interest, for example, former drivers who have more sympathy for certain drivers or riders. So, there's a theory, especially from Tim Mayer, we'll discuss him right about now as well, another steward. And as a result of this, there's been further discussion. So as F1 Clapped here on Twitter says, Johnny Herbert has made a few interesting comments recently. And even if you don't consider potential loyalties to certain drivers or whoever, he has in the past clearly partnered with Genting Casino, right? So, well, as you can see, not long ago, I mean, this is like 21st of October 2024, he's reposting Genting Casino UK's opportunity to win, a trip to the final Grand Prix. So you would think that a steward couldn't be associated with anything related to gambling or anything like that because, it opens the door to potential manipulation, does it not? I mean, I don't know if it's really a problem, but it just feels like a problem, right? And I think it's something that they have to get on top of. So that's the whole Johnny Herbert side. There's also Tim Mayer, who was mentioned effectively by Jos Verstappen, who is son of McLaren founder Teddy Mayer. So, let's be honest here, is he going to have, even if he doesn't feel it, is he going to have some degree of subconscious bias in favour of McLaren and their drivers? Possibly. I mean, maybe not. Maybe he's totally impartial. And it's difficult to find stewards, obviously, that are going to be absolutely 100% impartial on every single issue. Everyone's going to maybe have their favourites. Of course, you've got to put that aside and execute the rules in the way that they are written. But it just makes things kind of interesting, doesn't it? So that's the Tim Mayer piece, maybe pro-McLaren. The Johnny Herbert piece is interesting because he says he's a Verstappen fan, but obviously his comments on Verstappen make it sound like he's, always going to be looking for a reason to penalise him, would be the argument. And then, of course, you've got the Derek Warwick stuff. So here I am again. This is, this article that was posted in, I think it was January this year, maybe, in Business F1 magazine, because I talked about this Derek Warwick stuff in a video and somehow it made the news. But this has been known for some time that Derek Warwick has a Honda dealership and, look, Honda are in Formula 1 at the end of the day. So does that mean that Derek Warwick is making decisions in favour of Red Bull? Not necessarily, probably not, but it's there is a potential conflict of interest there, and that I think is the point that Jos Verstappen is making, and obviously people who are, Verstappen fans are saying, oh, well, look at Tim Mayer, look at Johnny Herbert, these guys are anti-Max or whatever, and then obviously people on the Lando side are saying, well, look at this Derek Warwick guy, he's pro-Max, but obviously this weekend's Mr. Warwick isn't in the steward's room, and these guys are, pretty much, Johnny Herbert certainly is. So that's the question, isn't it? It's we don't want the decisions being made on track to be at all influenced by the guys in the box. But, the reality is that maybe there's something like that going on. Now, Johnny Herbert, of course, comes out and says, there's also the British bias discussion. I think even Max said this recently, that he was if I had a British passport, people would treat me differently. And there were some funny comments during Mexico, can't believe that not having a British passport forced Lando off the track at turn 8, right? So, clearly on some level, Max's driving is Max's driving. But maybe Herbert's argument is, or people have said that, well, he's British, right? So is he going to have more affiliation for the British drivers? And he says there always seems to be an issue about us British stewards being biased. When we're in that room, we abide by the rules and the guidelines from the FIA. To say there's bias is ridiculous. And I'd love to think so, I'd love to think so. But, you look at the way things have had over the last few years, it's tough to imagine that things, the decisions are always entirely impartial. It's either, I think you can definitely look over the last few years and you can say either there's been some bias in play at times or there is just serious incompetence in play at times. One of which might be more likely than the other, but I'll leave you guys to give your thoughts in the comments below. But yeah, this weekend, Johnny Herbert's back in the steward's room, Derek Warwick isn't. So what does that mean? Well, we don't know. Hopefully nothing. Ideally nothing. But Jos Verstappen certainly doesn't seem to think so. Just before we close out the video, thought this is very interesting. I've made this point a couple of times, and now we have some data. Well, the data's always been there, but F1 guy Dan puts the data together on Lando versus Max. It's basically been, as we know, a 1v1 fight this season, but the point being really that obviously Perez has never really been in position to take points off Lando, but Piastri has been in position sometimes to take points off Max. The funny thing is that whenever he's done that, he's also finished ahead of Lando. So there's only been 5 Grand Prix this season where Piastri has finished ahead of Verstappen, that being Monaco, Hungary, of course one of the more controversial ones, Belgium, Spa, Monza and Baku. But the thing is, on all of those weekends, he's also finished ahead of Lando, right? There's never been a time where Lando's won, Piastri's been second or third, and Max has been behind Piastri. That's not happened. So, it is funny how it's worked out, and as Dan says here, certainly Hungary and Monza, as we said they would be at the time, will be topics of conversation when the season is over. But just to close out the video, this is the weekend so far. So I'll just hit the refresh to see if anything's changed here. This is Sao Paulo weather this weekend. This is tomorrow, the Friday, and there's potential for some action. Saturday looks very interesting indeed. We've got potential scattered thunderstorms, decent chance of rain, and then on the Sunday, the actual race day, it's a pretty similar forecast as well. There will be some intervention, I think, from the rain this weekend, and, well, how fascinating that turns out to be remains to be seen, but very much interested in your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.